The 7 heavenly virtues as boxers. Humility, the act of lesser view of self-importance, goes to Gennady Golovkin. Born on April 8, 1982, in Karaganda, Kazakhstan, to a Russian father and a South Korean mother, Golovkin had a tough upbringing. His father was a coal miner and his mom was an assistant in a chemical lab. Golovkin had 2 older brothers and 1 twin brother. His brothers encouraged Golovkin to get into boxing at 8 years old and would pick fights for him in the streets. Both of his older brothers joined the Soviet army and both of them ended up dying in the process. Golovkin was an exceptional amateur with a reported record of 345-5 and an Olympic silver medal. Golovkin made his pro debut on May 6, 2006 and was immediately an impressive talent. Golovkin made his U.S. debut and television debut on September 1st, 2012, taking on Polish contender Grzegorz Braxa. Initially, Golovkin was supposed to take on fellow undefeated fighter Dmitry Bivol, but Bivol had suffered a career-ending injury, forcing Golovkin to change opponents. Golovkin made a statement, putting a beating on the Polish fighter en route to a 5th-round stoppage. Golovkin went on a dominant tear, stopping his next 9 opponents after Braxa before finally unifying titles, taking on Canadian power puncher David Lemieux. This would be Golovkin's pay-per-view debut. At this point, Lemieux was looking powerful and was viewed as a genuine threat to Golovkin. It ended up being one of Golovkin's best performances, completely neutralizing Lemieux and dominating him, getting an 8th-round stoppage. On March 18, 2017, Triple G was set to take on top challenger Danny Jacobs. This is the first time Golovkin looked truly human. Jacobs pushed him to the limit and ended up nearly getting the victory, losing a close unanimous decision. For years now, the fight everyone wanted to see was Golovkin against Canelo Alvarez. Finally, the fight had been set. The fight ended up being a draw, with many feeling Golovkin deserved the win. They rematched and Alvarez won by controversial decision. Golovkin had a nice little run to end his career, winning a war against Sergey Derevyanchenko to become a 2-time champion, and then unifying against Japan's Ryota Murata to become the oldest unified champion in boxing. Golovkin accomplished being a 2-time unified champion. He has 15 wins and 13 wins by KO in world title fights and had one of the most dominant title runs in the sport ever. Yet, Golovkin is shown to be one of the most humble fighters in the sport. From the way he presents himself to the way he talks about his career and opponents, Golovkin has always been a soft-spoken destroyer. Even when Golovkin had bad blood with Alvarez, he kept his calm in the build-up and refrained from overly disrespecting his opponent. Golovkin has never been brash, never used talking to sell a fight, and isn't keen on boasting or bragging about himself. Patience is the act of delayed gratification and trusting the process. This is attributed to Dmitry Bivol. Born on December 18, 1990, Bivol got into boxing at the age of 6. He had an extensive amateur pedigree, going 268-15. Bivol made his pro debut on November 28, 2014, by his first title fight only 3 years later, taking on 20-1 Australian Trent Broadhurst. Bivol defended his title 7 times after becoming champion. All of these victories were very dominant. However, they weren't against the cream of the crop. Bivol had been gunning for a big fight for well over 3 years straight. It got to a point where people started to forget about Bivol and even doubt his level of ability. His momentum hit an all-time low and Bivol won a boring unanimous decision against fellow Russian Umar Salimov. Surprisingly, after all of these years of waiting for a big fight to arise, Bivol caught a break. Canelo Alvarez had just conquered 168 pounds and wanted to push himself more by winning a belt at 175. Alvarez had done this back in 2019, but Bivol was a different animal compared to an old, washed-up Sergey Kovalev, and Canelo Alvarez becoming a champion at 175 while simultaneously holding all the belts at 168 could have been huge. The fight between the two was set for May 7th, 2022. Alvarez was a big favorite at -550. He was pound for pound number 1 and had all of the momentum. Bivol had been waiting for this moment and made the most of it, outclassing Alvarez and winning by unanimous decision. Bivol had beaten the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter and had officially become a star in the sport of boxing. Bivol capitalized on this momentum by putting a beating on undefeated Gilberto Ramirez later in the year. While Bivol's career has been put on hold since November of 2022, with Bivol only having 1 fight in 2023 in a tune-up against Lyndon Arthur, Bivol is set to return on the 1st of June and will be taking on Artur Beterbiev for an undisputed crown right after that fight. Kindness is the act of being friendly and considerate. Shawn Porter has shown these qualities throughout his career and post-career. Born on October 27, 1987, Porter was one of America's best young talents, defeating the names such as Alexander Usyk and Danny Jacobs in the amateurs. Porter made his debut on October 3rd, 2008, and got his first title shot 5 years later, taking on fellow American Devin Alexander. In a statement, Porter brought the fight to Alexander, winning a unanimous decision to capture the IBF welterweight title. While Porter had some shortcomings after, as well as some highlights, such as becoming a two-time champion, Porter retired as a respected name in the sport and a fan favorite. Porter, throughout his career, was always respectful to opponents and the media, having a very charming but also relatable personality. It was after his career that makes his character look better. Porter started a podcast, and on his podcast, he'd have episodes of people he was friends with, but would even have guests such as Terrence Crawford, a previous opponent of Porter who actually beat him. The Fight Forum, a website dedicated to the opinions of boxing fans, had an article headlined with the statement, "Shawn Porter is the easiest guy in boxing to root for. Not just for his personality, but what he's given to the sport. Always took on the best, always came to fight, and always left everything in the ring." Diligence is the act of consistent work. One of the most diligent fighters in modern history is the Filipino Flash, Nonito Donaire. Born on November 16, 1982, coming from a fighting family, Donaire made his pro debut on February 22, 2001, over 23 years ago. Interestingly enough, Donaire actually lost his second professional fight. However, this early roadblock didn't slow Donaire down. 6 years after his debut, Donaire fought for the IBF World Flyweight title against Australian Vic Darchinyan. This was his first elite opponent, and Donaire was the underdog, as he was virtually unknown, taking on the undefeated champion. In a back-and-forth fight, it ended in a flash, with Donaire landing his signature hook and stopping the champion in the 5th round. After successfully defending his title multiple times, Donaire moved up in weight to challenge Mexico's Fernando Montiel. Holding the WBC and WBO titles at 118, Montiel was a respected, unified champ. Donaire looked sensational, demolishing Montiel in the 2nd round to become unified. Donaire kept his momentum going, taking on Argentina's Omar Narvaez, who ended up having one of the longest title reigns in boxing history, with 27 title defenses. Donaire ended 2011 strong, shutting Narvaez out. Donaire had shown tremendous success at 115 and 118, but wasn't content, moving up to 122 to challenge for the vacant WBO title. Donaire took on Wilfredo Vasquez Jr. While it wasn't dominant, Donaire deservingly got the victory, dropping Vasquez late and winning by split decision. Donaire once again wasted no time, unifying the IBF title 5 months later against South Africa's Jeffrey Mafabula, winning once again, this time by a wide, unanimous decision. Donaire won 2 more fights to close out the year, winning the Fighter of the Year for 2012. Donaire would go through some hardship after this tremendous year, getting upset and outboxed in his next fight against Guillermo Rigondeaux. After this, he won 2 fights before getting stopped for the first time in his career against Nicholas Walters. The Walters fight proved Donaire bit off more than he could chew, fighting a 126-pounder. Donaire moved back down to 122, winning a few tune-up fights before getting a shot at a vacant title against Cesar Juarez. It wasn't vintage Donaire, but he got the job done, winning a unanimous decision and scoring 2 knockdowns in the process. Donaire would take on undefeated contender Jassy Magdaleno shortly after, where the young Magdaleno was too fresh for Donaire, winning by unanimous decision. It was back to the drawing board again for Donaire. He decided to move back up to 126. Donaire had a soft touch against Ruben Garcia, winning by decision before traveling to Belfast to take on former unified champion Carl Frampton. In a pretty clear fight, Frampton defeated Donaire by decision. While many felt it might have been time for Donaire to hang it up, he moved all the way back down to 118. Donaire joined the World Boxing Super Series, a tournament against the top fighters in his weight class. Donaire's first bout in the tournament was against undefeated champion Ryan Burnett. In the bout, Burnett was winning clearly, but Donaire was closing the gap before Burnett injured himself, giving Donaire the victory and giving him the WBA title. Donaire then took on late replacement Stefan Young, sparking him out in the 6th round, before Donaire was set to take on the monster Naoya Inoue in the final. Very few gave Donaire any chance, with many feeling he'd get demolished by Inoue. It ended up being Fight of the Year. Donaire ended up losing on points, but ended up giving a tremendous showing, bloodying and hurting Inoue, while pushing the heavy favorite to his limit. We can all guess what Donaire did after the loss. He continued fighting at world level, taking on undefeated French champion Nordine Oubali. As he was nearly 40 years old and coming off another loss, he was the underdog again. Donaire ended up knocking Ubali out in the 4th round in a truly impressive victory. It's worth noting that Donaire was a pro fighter for 22 years and was competing at world level for over 15 years, while fighting in multiple weight classes and overcoming defeat multiple times. True fortitude. Charity is voluntarily giving. A charitable man is Big George Foreman. Born on January 10, 1949 in Marshall, Texas, Foreman had a very poor upbringing. Boxing saved him from a life of poverty. Foreman made his debut on June 23, 1969, and ended up having a tremendous boxing career, being considered one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. He accumulated a record of 76-5 with 68 KOs. He took on names such as Joe Frazier, Muhammad Ali, Ken Norton, Evander Holyfield, and more. He won Fighter of the Year in 1973 and 1976. He won Comeback Fighter of the Year in 1994. He was ranked the 9th biggest puncher of all time and the 4th greatest heavyweight of all time by Ring Magazine. George Foreman has his own charity called the Foreman Foundation, where they raise funds for medical research. Foreman also helped donate 1.5 million meals to Feeding America. He also founded the George Foreman Youth and Community Center, which is made for kids who needed a sense of direction. He has donated $100,000 to AIDS Foundation as well, and Foreman also donated a cool $1 million to the MD Cancer Center. Temperance is refraining from alcohol. Bernard Hopkins achieved greatness with this virtue. Born on January 15, 1965, Hopkins made his pro debut at 23 years old and actually lost his first fight. He would go on a win streak before losing years later to future legend Roy Jones Jr. on points for the vacant IBF middleweight title. Hopkins would get another opportunity to fight for the same title over 1 year later, taking on Ecuador's Segundo Mercado, settling for a draw. Hopkins would avenge this draw 4 months later, dominating en route to a 7th round stoppage. Something must have clicked for Hopkins, as after this bout, he started to absolutely dominate his opponents. On April 14, 2001, Hopkins finally got to unify, taking on 36-2 Keith Holmes for the IBF and WBC middleweight titles. Hopkins outclassed Holmes, winning by unanimous decision. Hopkins then took on Puerto Rican icon 40-0 Felix Tito Trinidad for undisputed. In a career performance, Hopkins stopped Trinidad in the 12th round to solidify himself as a living legend. Hopkins would eventually get dethroned by hungry Jermaine Taylor. On October 18, 2008, Hopkins took on undefeated Kelly Pavlik. The young Pavlik was coming off of a lot of momentum, defeating the man that beat Hopkins twice in Jermaine Taylor. It was retro Hopkins. He absolutely schooled Pavlik, winning an extremely dominant unanimous decision. Hopkins also avenged his loss against Jones, beating him by unanimous decision on April 3, 2010. Hopkins took on Canadian John Pascal for the unified IBF and WBA titles after. Pascal was a very elite and respected fighter, and actually ended up having a solid career overall. This fight resulted in a draw. They had a rematch 5 months later, with Hopkins getting the unanimous decision win and becoming a champion at a whopping 46 years old. Hopkins would lose his title to elite Chad Dawson by a majority decision afterwards. Hopkins had one last run, taking on undefeated Tavares Cloud for the IBF light heavyweight title. Hopkins became a champion once again, winning a unanimous decision. Hopkins was 48 years old, by far the best longevity in boxing history. Temperance played a factor. Hopkins claimed, "I don't drink on holidays, I don't drink alcohol, period. Not wine, not nothing." Hopkins' tremendous discipline cannot be denied. He achieved a feat that may very well not become achieved ever again in the entire sport. Chastity is abstaining from sexual activity. This goes to the greatest, Muhammad Ali, the first and only 3-time lineal heavyweight champion, the first heavyweight champion to come out of retirement and regain the title, won 22 world heavyweight championship fights, made 19 successful title defenses, is 11-0 in rematches, has wins against Archie Moore, Sonny Liston twice, Floyd Patterson, Ken Norton twice, Joe Frazier, George Foreman, and many more. 6-time Fighter of the Year, 1970s Fighter of the Decade, named Athlete of the Century by GC Sports, named Sportsman of the 29th Century by the BBC, and was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2010. Allegedly, Ali would abstain for up to 2 months before a big fight. Now, Ali getting the spot on the list doesn't make him the epitome of it, as he's been labeled a sex addict before. Ali does advocate heavily for staying away from constant sexual activity, however, and he states, in quotes, "You can't keep your mind on fighting when you're thinking about a woman. You can't keep your concentration." While articles written by non-athletes claim that Ali and Mike Tyson are ridiculous for abstaining before big fights or fights in general, the results clearly speak for themselves, with many considering Ali the greatest fighter of all time.